Hello, everybody. Good morning and welcome to Digital Hammurabi. I am your host, Megan Lewis, and today I am joined by the wonderful Maya Deane, who is the author of the brand new Wrath Goddess Sing, which we're going to be talking about today. If you are not familiar with this book, I read it last week. It's amazing. Go and buy it, preferably right now, but you can wait till the end of the stream if you really have to. So we'll be talking about the book and writing historical fiction and just about the ancient world in general. Maya, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Would you just very briefly give a bit of an introduction for people who aren't familiar with you?
Sure. I'm a writer. And Wrath Goddess Sing is a retelling of the story of Achilles. So that contains the Iliad, of course, but it's not limited to the Iliad. But taking it into the Bronze Age setting as opposed to the sort of Greek mythology nowhere land that it's generally interpreted in, which I think is a little closer to how it would have been perceived in its own time.
I have to say, reading it as an Assyriologist, it made my little historian heart very, very happy. It's beautifully situated in history and in the relevant cultures, and you have clearly done a massive amount of research going into this book. So what kind of prompted you to take Achilles and focus the entire book on her?
Well, part of it is like a long-standing fascination with Achilles. I mean, growing up, I was introduced to the Iliad very young, and I sort of glommed onto Athena and then by extension Achilles, because in the text, they're quite closely connected in weird ways. I mean, everyone sort of focuses on the Achilles-Thetis relationship, but the Achilles-Athena relationship is weird. Like, first thing we really see of them interacting is Athena literally grabbing Achilles by the hair and being like, "Don't kill Agamemnon."
No, it was really interesting the way you took the original source material and adapted it and changed. I think that the changes you made were very, very cleverly done and very necessary for the story that you were telling. So in the book, you take the relationship between Achilles and Athena and you make them mother and daughter, which was, I think, it was on my part unexpected and I think very clever and a really useful way to be able to examine that relationship more fully.
Yeah, part of it is that like trans women generally have multiple mothers. That's just sort of how it tends to go. And I kind of wanted to explore that dynamic so that you have sort of, you've got your birth mother, but then you also tend to have one or more trans mothers. And that spiritual or non-biological mother relationship was really interesting to just sort of think about in the context of Athena and Achilles. And situating it like that let me examine it in a way that I don't think has been done before. Probably one of the reasons that I really like one of the things that really sort of, I guess, the piece of grit that gets inside the oyster was actually when I was pretty young. I first heard the sort of Achilles among the maidens Skyros story, but it was very downplayed in that Edith Hamilton way where it's just like, oh, this is a minor episode, please don't look at it too closely. And then I discover, like, in addition to the artistic source material, which is obviously non-narrative, but very suggestive, you also have, well, Statius, whose version of Achilles on Skyros is horrifying. You're familiar?
I'm actually not, no.
Okay. So Statius basically tries to take the most gender variant possible episode of Achilles' life and turn it into the most Roman masculinity kind of thing he can. So essentially all of the, like, Achilles being on Skyros as a woman is entirely blamed on Thetis. And it's just like, Mom, please let me go to war. No, I have to keep you from war. But it's my destiny to kill 1 million people. No, it's your destiny to die. I will now force feminize you. And then Statius, it's not a finished piece. It kind of breaks off partway through, but Statius does get to the point where it's like, he stages like a transmisogynist fantasy of like infiltrating women's spaces to rape princesses, which is very masculine, very virilizing to a Roman, but
not so
not a
great for
fan.
everyone else. Yeah. It was, I think, a really nice opening to have Achilles in this place of peace and solace and safety, where she's finally found like family and belonging, and then having like not necessarily like the Greek world, but like the royal patriarchal society that she's retreated from, like invade that. Even though I feel like Odysseus was he was beautifully written, by the way. That was really lovely. But he wasn't like aggressive about it, but it was very clear that they're here to find Achilles. They will take her away again, like kind of regardless of how she feels about the whole situation. And that disruption kind of bleeds through into Achilles' relationship with the princess, whose name I absolutely cannot pronounce.
Idamia.
Thank you. And it kind of destabilizes the whole world that Achilles has come to find as a sanctuary. I was sad, which I assume was kind of the point, but it was.
Oh, me too.
It was
Me
a sad thing. So when you go about researching the setting for an historical novel like this, especially one that in the source material doesn't have like a firm time, the place like is kind of down, but it doesn't have like a firm like time span. How did you kind of go about pinning down the time that you wanted the novel to be set in, and then trying to find all of the kind of little disparate bits of information about life in that time and place that really make the novel very believable and very grounded for a myth, very grounded in historical reality?
So what I did to pin down the time was, first I started with, I mean, there's a range of times that are generally considered like, that since ancient times have been batted around as the date of the Iliad. Mm-hmm. So somewhere between 1300 and like 1180. And it's definitely set in the Bronze Age Mycenaean world and towards the end of it. Like the Bronze Age collapse is supposed to have happened according to all of the classical mythology, which granted is hundreds of years later, but it's supposed to have happened within 2 generations after the war. And that can be pretty well pinpointed to sometime in the 12th century. So sometime in the late 13th century seemed like the obvious place. So I kind of ended up settling on the exact date a little bit by deciding who I wanted to be still alive. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, Khemweset was a particular figure that I did not want to be dead because I wanted him to be in the book. Mm-hmm. And I wanted Ramses II to still be alive because reasons.
Why not?
Why not? It makes the grandpapa lines land a little better.
It really does. That was so for those who haven't read the book, there's a character in there, Mariapi, who is an Egyptian princess, and like the familiar relationship between her and the rest of the royal family that is kind of told through her eyes it's really kind of like sweet. I enjoyed that very much.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, she, like, to write her, I drew heavily on her famous historical grandmother, Nefertari or Naptera, if we're going to use accurate pronunciations, which I didn't do for the Egyptian names. For rhetorical reasons, I wanted people to know who they were. Mm-hmm. We'll get into transliteration, I guess, later. So once I'd set roughly the time, I mean, there are still huge error bands on like a lot of things. So it's hard to say whether, for instance, my guesses about what would have been in fashion in the 1220s are quite on. It's very likely that you have all sorts of micro variations that just didn't make it into the record at all. Mm-hmm. So to a certain extent, part of it is just figuring out what was definitely the case, and then what is likely if we just assume that people are human and are not trying to live in a historical period, but are actually people who happen to live at a particular time.
Yeah.
Which actually, yeah, that was something that was pretty important to me, just making sure that individual variation existed, that you could sort of see what kind of person what someone was by how they related to their own, I want to say culture, but also like culture is an abstraction that we use to kind of make sense of a very disparate past. So yeah, just preserving the idea that there's a huge amount of variation, that that no one walks around thinking, I'm living in the ancient Hittite Empire.
I must display all of these markers of the ancient Hittites. It's very
exactly.
Well, it was very nicely done, and I squealed internally when Meriapi is introduced, because Achilles kind of walks into the tent that Meriapi and Patroclus share, and she's writing cuneiform, and it was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful, mainly because, excuse me, not only do you almost never see cuneiform in historical fiction, but it was, for me, instantly situated it in this kind of international, multicultural, like Bronze Age space. That was, it was lovely. I very much enjoyed it, and the whole, Meriapi just generally is a wonderful figure.
Oh gosh, no! If she were trying to like reorder wine in Memphis, I'm sure she would like scrawl it in a cursive, Egyptian script, like the drink labels from Malkata, but like, there's no way she's going to be corresponding with a relative in anything but proper
Akkadian. So I have to ask about Helen, who is like typically seen as this damsel in distress princess, kind of. She's been stolen, she's used as this pawn of the gods, and you take her and you make her not only like the ultimate bad guy in the book, but an incredible, powerful being who's like immortal and seemingly responsible for all like the falls of humanity. Where did that come from? Because that was a stroke of genius.
So part of it was a narrative decision, because Helen and Eris occupy a similar role in the myth, which is why when one fades out, another comes in. Part of it was paying less attention to the sort of Edith Hamilton tradition, which kind of situates Helen as an emblem of blameless femininity, and instead paying a little more attention to the Iliad and also to some of the classical conversation around Helen. So the first things we see Helen do in the Iliad are go to the walls to check on the fighting because she's curious. And then she's just like, who do I recognize down there? Where are my brothers? Do they not care enough to be here? And then instantly the narrator's like, her brothers had died years before, but she had no idea. Then she is like in her rooms and she's like making a tapestry of the Achaeans and the Trojans fighting a war over her. And she's like, yeah, this has artistic merit. And then this
is a sane and reasonable thing for me to be doing right now.
This is a sane and reasonable thing for me to be doing right now. This is my war. So that fascinated me. And it's so different from the kind of agency-less Helen that that I guess is vaguely on screen with Brad Pitt.
It was good. And when Helen enters the narrative, Achilles is broken into Troy to try and like find Helen and bring her home and end the war early, which, fair play. I think that's a marvelous idea. And Achilles climbs on top of this temple to try and like locate where she needs to go, and sees Helen off in the distance, like in a courtyard surrounded by mirrors. And that's kind of the first inkling you get that actually all is not well here. This is not going to go how Achilles has planned. And bless her, she dives right in anyway.
Well, yeah, that's Achilles. Always diving right in. The other thing that I was interested in doing with Helen was I couldn't find a way to bring Putuchepa into the narrative, despite the fact that this is like roughly contemporaneous with her. But this is like a wild period in ancient Eastern Mediterranean history. Like, you've got figures like Pudhakhepa who are literally like corresponding with the king of Egypt, telling him that he needs to get out more if he doesn't realize that Babylon is still a great kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And then going to temples to chill with her best friend, a goddess.
Who doesn't do that?
Yeah, who doesn't do that? And so once I made the decision to make Helen Hittite, which kind of makes sense, especially given the geopolitical context of like the 13th and 14th centuries, where you've got the Achaeans trying to challenge the Hittites and ultimately apparently failing catastrophically, but then writing stories about how they actually won. Once that came apart together, I sort of started bringing in like sun goddess of Arena imagery for Helen, and then it was, given the whole syncretism approach that I was taking, it was really easy to bring in some Eye of Ra mythology and stuff like that. And Helen sort of emerges as this personification of chaos who's actually having a really good time.
Yeah, it's like the sheer glee that is very apparent in how she behaves and how she speaks to Achilles. Like, she's having a ball. This is actually the time of her life.
Yeah.
And you're kind of sitting there thinking, thousands of people are dying. You are. And this kind of feeds into something that was very striking to me as well, reading through the book, is how you characterize the gods. I feel like a lot of times retellings of mythology, like the gods are capricious, sure, and they're not really human, but they're kind of human, and they squabble like human families. And the way you write them is utterly terrifying and absolutely, completely divorced from any kind of human experience. And I think what makes Helen so chilling is that you expect humanity through like the first quarter of the book up until Achilles meets her. And it kind of even trickles through afterwards. And then finally you realize, actually, there is nothing human in this woman at all. And then you kind of see the full scale of not only like Helen's plot maybe, but how the other gods are like feeding into and reinforcing this just absolute bloodbath. And actually that the whole bloodbath is the point. It was quite unnerving at times.
Part of that was thinking in terms of like historical time. So if we make the gods people at all, if we make them characters who exist in time, as opposed to sort of timeless personifications, then they're going to get weird. One of the things that fascinated me about all of the mythology, like there's multiple birthplaces attested for Zeus, for instance. One of them is Mount Sipylos, which I'm a fan of because of the heavy Hittite iconography that makes it into classical Zeus, who's a very minor god in the Mycenaean period, it looks like. It's kind of hard to tell because like people are measuring these things by like frequency of inscriptions. And by that logic, Demeter should have been super, super, super important. And even Poseidon, much less so. But with that in mind, the idea that gods have birthplaces, gods are born, gods die, gods live a very long time, I started to think, okay, to these characters, the contemporary period is the present. They're not like we're in the Bronze Age. They're existing in their modernity, which means there's a past and there's a deep past, and there are all sorts of their stories about the deep past that are permanently lost to us. And the closest we can get is the sort of mysterious pre-textual gleanings of like the Neolithic, which is millennia and millennia where we just have a little bit of information. But what we have is so suggestive and mysterious, it seems like a logical place to sort of set the gods coming of age. And with that in mind, I mean, in some ways, the period between 10,000, well, 11,000 and I guess 5,000 years ago, in some ways is wonderful for humans, and in a lot of ways is like disastrous for humans, just in terms of the individual human experience, at least as far as we can tell from their remains. Gods who presided over all of that and were perhaps traumatized by it, but also nourished and fed by it, would have a strange life story, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So thinking of that narratively, and also trying to think in terms of how some mythological shifts could also be narrativized, like the prominence of Ra in the Old Kingdom and the sort of syncretization of Ra with other figures, and particularly Amun later on, suggested to me narrative possibilities if you turn the historical change of ideas into events that happened to the gods.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, anything that lives that long is going to get very weird.
Yeah, absolutely. Even if they started normal, like that amount of time and seeing that much change is going to do things, I think, to your psyche. Now you've mentioned syncretization a couple of times, and the book is very clear that the gods are these eternal beings, that the names change, but essentially they're the same beings. One, and most of them are syncretizations that I was relatively familiar with, because if you study ancient history, it's a thing that happens. I was very interested with the Athena Aten connection that you made. What prompted that?
That's a complicated question. One second. So part of it was to establish a certain tension in the character, because Athena is this very complicated, messy being who seems to simultaneously have these ideals of things making sense, of some sort of like order that the gods are generally too chaotic to cooperate with. And at the same time, of course, she's kind of a being who's been through a lot of history. Part of it is the way that Mott, if we're going to use like, which we're not, is one of the few like divine figures that doesn't get prescribed during the Amarna period. And for essentially aesthetic reasons, I'm sort of relating Mott and Seshat to each other. And because I've gone with this like sort of bird goddess thing for Athena, where you've got these sort of Neolithic shadows behind them of kind of personifications of animals being their vibe, it was fairly straightforward to syncretize sun as justice with feather as justice. There's the ghost of a maybe philological link. If you squint, Yatin can be Potniatana. But mostly I went with that because I thought it would make for an interesting dynamic.
It's an excellent reason. And I have to say it paid off. So I'm going to tell the audience, because I don't think I've mentioned it so far, if you have some questions for Maya about the book or about her thoughts on the ancient world, pop them in the chat and we will get to them before we finish. We're about half an hour in, so we'll maybe go for 15 more minutes. If you have questions, get them in and I will share them with Maya. I did also want to ask, you're clearly just generally very interested in the ancient world. What is your favorite place and time period?
That is such an interesting question. Usually it's whatever I'm researching right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm incredibly fascinated by like late 18th dynasty Egyptian empire stuff, because when I went to Luxor, I realized just like how the extent to which the naked imperialism had been undersold.
Mm-hmm.
Like I went to Luxor Temple and there were 2 thrones, and one is just covered in neck shackled kings from Sudan, and one is covered in neck shackled kings from Canaan. And just the entire ethos is so strikingly not just imperialism, but imperialism where the power is the thing that justifies the power, instead of like
It's not some moral underpinning or religious underpinning. It just is, I am more powerful than you.
Yeah, there's no like Achaemenid style, I'm here to bring justice and also tax you. It's more like, well, I can grab all your hair at once and smack 1,000 people over the head with a club. And so look how cool I am doing it. And that is just so striking. I'm fascinated by what the stories power tells about itself.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a particular example. So currently I'm doing a lot of research on that period. More tantalizingly, I'm very fascinated by like the early Akkadian Empire.
Mm.
I say tantalizingly because there's so much I can't do. Like it would be extremely difficult for me to arrange to go take a look. And there's so much less information available.
Mm-hmm.
Now, hopefully current excavations turn up massive numbers of new texts.
That would be wonderful.
That would be amazing. But in the meantime, the little that I can glean is very interesting.
Mm-hmm. For those watching who are unfamiliar, that's the period with Enheduanna, who's the first ever recorded author, also high priestess of the moon god Nana and princess, like Sargon of Akkad's daughter. And she just generally has a fascinating life story.
Incredibly interesting.
It's a wonderful period. Yeah.
She's incredibly interesting, and going into reading her works, I was expecting a little more pro Nana sentiment.
It's just not that.
She's not even a fan. She's just like, it's like, loser wasn't there when I needed him.
This is my job.
This is my job. Honestly, I'm more of an Inanna person. Inanna shows up when you need her. Don't be a disrespectful mountain.
Oh, words for us all to live by, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
So we do not have any questions. So I'm assuming you all are just stunned by how interesting this is. Maisel does say this sounds like a really exciting novel. And it absolutely is. For those joining us late, this is Wrath Goddess Sing by Maya. It takes the story of Achilles as a trans woman and really badass warrior. Like I would not want to cross her literally ever, because she will fuck you up. And do so with, I think, a moderate amount of pleasure. But it's a fascinating book. Yeah, oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a fascinating book, and it really kind of explores the Iliad, and specifically through the lens of Achilles' life, which allows you, I think, Maya, to expand the story in a really interesting way, because you're not just focusing on the war. It's the war kind of as a backdrop for this woman's life and her relationships, and then the kind of ancillary little adventures that she goes on. I also enjoyed very much the cattle raid, which I was not expecting. And also the Amazons. There are Amazons. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. We haven't even talked about Briseis.
That's a very good point.
We have to talk about Briseis, and then I will let you go and get on with the rest of your day. But could you tell me about what you do with the character of Briseis, who is not actually Briseis in your novel?
Yes. Well, to do that, I have to talk about the Amazons, which, I mean, if we look at the classical Greeks, they were absolutely 100% convinced that the Amazons were historical. It actually, you can see the exact moment where revisionist classical Greek historians start to say, well, maybe there weren't really Amazons. That seems a little far-fetched. But before that point, everyone's just like, yeah, this city was founded by Amazons. This city is founded by Amazons. This city is founded by Amazons. There's an Amazon grave right there. And Scythians, actually, it's interesting because Herodotus says in passing that the Amazons and the Scythians are not identical, but that the Scythians kind of had a cultural relationship with the Amazons and learned a lot of stuff from them. So there's some basis for at least thinking that classical Greeks believed the Amazons to be a separate and earlier group from the Scythians. That's roughly what I went with, or I would have given them like Scythian language names. And I mean, there's a huge amount of graves of Scythian warriors. Obviously, there's like increasingly the archaeological record is confirming that, in fact, the Pontic steppe was full of warrior cultures with quite a few women in their cavalry. So one thing that I did was think back to, like, the Bronze Age is a period of small horses, very small horses. And chariots have their initial start partially because you wouldn't really want to sit on a Bronze Age horse unless you're tiny. So that gave me a pretty clear idea of like, well, okay, suppose the Amazons put their smallest people on horses. They are credited in classical sources, at least, with inventing the idea of cavalry as opposed to chariotry. Mm-hmm. So that just made sense. And from there, it wasn't difficult to... Maisel, I think so. Yes. I recall what you're talking about, but not clearly enough to be able to give you a definite answer. Something about that makes me want to like go back to my books before answering that. So something like that. But yeah, so the Scythians and the Amazons in all the sources that we have like an interesting relationship to gender, especially relative to like classical Greek ideas of gender. So for instance, one of the things that I was always fascinated by in classical artwork is you've got these scenes of like veiled Athenian women just sort of peering at like Amazons with tattoos flexing. And this shows up on like pots and stuff. So that gave me a vibe to play with of at least the cultural memory of what the Amazons might have been like. And in such, you know, and then I wanted to explore different relationships of societies to transness. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that appears in Greek mythology set in the Mycenaean period, though it would be nice if we could actually get some closer look into the Mycenaean period itself, but alas, they did not write down answers to all our questions.
It's very inconsiderate of them, really.
I know. I can get to Wonder Woman, but I'll get there. So in Greek mythology set in the Mycenaean period, there are quite a few examples of transmasculine characters being relatively routinely accepted. In fact, a bunch of them are mentioned in Wrath Gotta Sing, but like type examples would include like Kynos, Iphis, depending on your interpretation, Tiresias can easily be read as transmasculine. And it seems like, at least in the classical period looking back, the idea of transmasculinity wasn't particularly shocking or weird, unlike the stigma applied to transfemininity. So one thing, and we see that like reflected in Achilles' experiences on the mainland and with the sort of patriarchal royal culture. I was interested in inverting that and imagining how the Amazons might be sort of more matter of fact about transfemininity, but perhaps deeply suspicious of transmasculinity. So Briseis in my book is Briseis, and he's got a very different vibe. The reason he ends up in the Achaean camp is quite different. And his role in the story is also quite different, but in ways where you could sort of imagine the memory of it collapsing into something like the Iliad narrative 500 years later.
Mm-hmm. He was,
and honestly, I just went with him mostly because I thought he was really cool.
He was really cool, and someone a very well-rounded character. And actually that so Lexi Henning and I are starting a podcast. I've mentioned this to you before, and we recorded our first episode yesterday, which covers the first half of Wrath Goddess thing. And something that we were saying about Briseis is all of the characters, actually, they're all very, very well-rounded, and they come across as real people, like you were saying, who are actually embedded in the time and place that you're writing about. Who they're not like just characters put in this scenery. They're products of where they are and when they are. And Briseis is a fantastic character who really, I think, adds an awful lot to the story and to the exploration of, like you were saying, transness that kind of runs throughout the book. And having that inversion, again, very unexpected, but I think very, very well done and well written and highly enjoyable. And we haven't, okay, so I'm not going to ask you about this because we're kind of getting towards the end of our time, and I don't want to spoil everything for the readers, but you have to read this book for all of the reasons just mentioned, but also to witness the relationship between Achilles and Agamemnon, which is also, like, I feel like I've said this 12 times this morning, not what you expect, but I think much more interesting maybe than what we expect coming to a story about the Iliad. And Lexi and I were saying, generally, we dislike Achilles just on principle. He's not a nice person in the myth, in most retellings of it. And he comes across as actually a very sympathetic character here. And I think you do an excellent job with that.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. I sense an area of research before I do anything that directly touches on the Scythians.
We have one quick question before we head out. Catherine wants to know, can you give us a hint as to what your next story is about?
Yeah, I'm currently midway through a book that is essentially, it's an exploration of ancient Egyptian imperialism in the late 18th dynasty, unsurprisingly, and it focuses on the figure of Kia and also ties into the Joseph in Egypt myths, because that seems like the logical time and place to set it if you're interested in exploring the undercurrents of post-colonial experience in the Joseph in Egypt myths.
I'm excited for that. Kia turns up briefly in Wrath Goddess. So if you would like to know who Kia is and how she figures in the book, you should, again, just go and buy it. It's not terribly expensive, and it's a wonderful read. We are going to end there. Maya, thank you so very much for joining me. It was an absolute pleasure to both talk to you and read your book, so thank you for both.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great pleasure.
Of course. Audience, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your thoughtful and engaging comments. And we will be back. I don't know when, but we will be back because I am now back at work and scheduling more interviews. So thank you all very much. And until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?
Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/digitalhammurabi to see how you can help.